Record this.
Oh, good.
And Paige, if you want to pull up the slides. Thank you all for joining us today for our community conversation. This month we're focused on anti-Semitism, and we're grateful to have two thought leaders with us to share their expertise. We have Rabbi Sam Yolen and Josh Schoenberg, who I will allow to introduce themselves. Rabbi, you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Shalom, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces and to meet some new faces. I'm super blessed to be part of Chester County. It's only been about a year and a half, but just a quick background. I was ordained about 7 years ago at a pluralistic rabbinical seminary in Yonkers, New York. Pluralism means that I was trained to help facilitate Jewish ritual depending on where a person sees themselves in the Jewish world, from orthodoxy to reform, progressive, pluralistic, renewal, reconstruction. These are some of the different language tools and theological, concepts that I was given in order to help people. And it's hard to be a Jewish person without any sort of personal experience of anti-Semitism. So I've had my own experiences of going back from public school in Connecticut, where I grew up, to workplace experiences as well. I spent 5 years in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. One of those years was I was also working 40 hours a week at the Lebanon VA hospital as a chaplain, primarily to non-Jewish patients at the hospital and military vets. And now I'm here in Westchester, in Kesher, Israel, for the last year and a half. I've been rabbi here.
Glad you are here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Josh Schoenberg. I'm from Wilmington, Delaware, but Beth and I have been friends a long time, so she offered and I accepted to join the conversation today. Just sort of a little bit about my background. I am the co-chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Delaware, which is sort of the government affairs arm of Jewish Federation in different communities around the country, as well as I serve on the Jewish Federation of Delaware board, and I'm also involved with a national young leadership program through Jewish Federation called National Young Leadership Cabinet, where I serve as the Israel and Overseas chair, and our job is to promote the U.S.-Israel relationship, both the United States but abroad, but also with the Jewish communities outside of Israel. And have an opportunity to meet and work with many of those communities around the world, excuse me. So just very excited to be here today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I guess I have a few thank you to our promotional partners who helped spread the word about this. I'm excited to see a lot of new faces today. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you haven't joined these community conversations before, we just want to make sure everyone is respectful. While we're playing the video, if you want to mute yourself and turn off your video and eat your lunch, you're perfectly welcome to. And just, have a nice conversation. We have room for discussion at the end, and you can also use the chat throughout the session. Okay, so to continue, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Yolen to kind of lead us through some defining terms and some original discussion points, and then we'll watch a video and then we'll have a nice discussion.
Okay, so Judaism, is it race? Is it ethnicity? Is it culture? Is it nationality, faith, heritage? The answer, it's complicated. Although an even deeper answer to that, which I saw Dara Horn, the famous author who wrote the book Jews, People Love Dead Jews, spoke about how Judaism actually is all these things because it predates all these things. The idea of nationality is only about 250 years old, 300 years old. The idea of religion might be 2,000 years old. Faith, there's no real word for Jewish religion in the Torah because it's just what Jews are and who Jews are. Anti-Semitism, similarly, is a concept that is so predating Western civilization that the first anti-Semite is actually Pharaoh. And in the Bible, Pharaoh describes certain characteristics that appear like conspiracy, which is projected on Jewish people And it's very similar to the language of anti-Semitism, depending on the era of anti-Semitic thought. So here it says prejudice against Jewish people, negative perception of Jews expressed as a disrespect or hatred, can be directed towards Jewish individuals, property, community institutions, and religious facilities. Not simply a form of religious, racial, ethnic prejudice, uniquely functions as a conspiracy theory rooted in lies about Jewish power and influence that are used to sow distrust in our institutions and our democracy. Hen-Mazik on the right side of the page talks about the far right and the left wing. The idea of anti-Semitism is it takes the form of the most palatable ideological appeals depending on your pre-existing social group. So it's called the horseshoe theory, where the far right looks at Jews as not white, the far left looks at Jews as too white, but together they exist on the same hatred of Jews, which is why approximately half of the anti-Semitic incidents are from the far left and approximately half are from the far right. That actually excuses anti-Semitism from, oftentimes you have ethnic nationalism in Islamist culture. That's not mentioned here. Far right and far left, at least in Hen-Mazik's point on the right here, is related to America culture, but there's more to that. So we can go to the next slide now. Zionism is a really important term to define because, as I might have mentioned, sometimes it's the language that we use that can be inverted to make anti-Semitism palatable. Zionism at its base and core means that a state should exist for the Jewish people in the ancestral homeland of Israel. Now, for people who say they're not Zionists, they might not realize this, but they're actually advocating for the removal or the persecution of half the world's Jews that live in that area. Leo Leibovitz, who's a writer and a thought leader for Tablet Magazine, for Sapir Journal, for a number of organizations, the Free Press by Barry Weiss, recently spoke about how for individuals who believe that they're anti-Zionists, if they believe that Israel shouldn't exist, there were so many Jewish refugees from even before World War II that would have had nowhere to go. So the idea that the state of Israel shouldn't exist really condemns them to death, which is quite a heavy charge. So Zionism does not preclude, this is important, does not preclude the support for Palestinian self-determination and statehood. And Zionism itself was the center of a lot of Jewish debates over 100, 150 years ago in order to bolster how to have a Jewish community that can provide for its own security needs while still supporting the self-determination of the Palestinian people. Anti-Zionism is defined here as prejudice against the Jewish movement for self-determination and the right for the Jewish people to a homeland in the state of Israel may be motivated by or result in anti-Semitism. I again want to say that anti-Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people should not have a state in the ancestral homeland of Israel. And I've met people whom appear as allies, and they'll say things like, of course I believe Israel should exist. I believe it should exist with all of the refugees of other backgrounds who need to settle there, which in fact would not create a Jewish state or a secure Jewish habitation in the ancestral homeland of Israel. That would just be a window into a state that would be like any other state where Jews are a minority and can suffer from institutionalized persecution or populist persecution. So it's important to really understand that some of these anti-Zionist platforms are coordinated efforts to disempower Jewish people, whether in the diaspora in places like America or in Israel, by means of alienating Israel as a pariah state on the international geopolitical level.
My turn? Okay.
Yeah, Josh, and just
Right.
so you know, if you would like to jump in as I'm talking about any of these slides,
Yeah.
I know it's our pictures are on the top and indicating when we're supposed to speak or not, but you can of course jump in and share your thoughts as well.
Great. Thank you. And I may just, I'm going to bounce back a little bit. I'll leave the slides where they are, Beth, but there's a couple things I just want to hit on and again, want to keep this conversation going. Something that I've learned in some of the work I've done with Jewish Federation is really moving away from the term anti-Semitism and really focusing on what it is at its core, and that's Jew hatred. I think, especially with so much of anti-Semitism on the rise now since October 7th of last year, many would say, well, I'm Semitic. I can't be anti-Semitic. But there's the focus, as the rabbi said, that when it comes down to the core of being anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic is not supporting the idea of a Jewish homeland and a safe and secure Israel. Couple thoughts that have come to me or friends that have shared with me. One of my friends who's regarding Jew hatred, his Holocaust survivor grandfather would always mention to him whenever he had doubts about Judaism is that never forget that you are Jewish because they will never forget you are Jewish. And it just goes to the core of how important it is to maintain the support of the Jewish community and maintain your own identity. As the rabbi said, being pro-Israel doesn't mean you're anti-Palestinian. I know many people who would consider themselves pro-Israel who would also be pro-Palestinian because as the vast majority, certainly of the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community could say, is that a Palestinian state next to a safe and secure Israel is what will keep everybody safe and secure. And another thought, I can't remember who it was from. I want to think it might have been Elie Wiesel, but I'm not certain that there's a lot of discussion that if it wasn't for the Holocaust, there wouldn't be in Israel, and that the thought was that Israel didn't happen because of the Holocaust, but the Holocaust happened because there wasn't in Israel. There wasn't a safe and independent nation for for Jews to become safe and to live a safe life. So getting to
Yeah,
some of the statistics. Oh, I'm sorry, please.
yeah. No, I not only do I agree with that, I mean, many Jewish refugees of that time period would have probably rather immigrated to the Western world, but the doors of immigration had been locked out to them. So there are some categories of what the state of Israel is that people who maybe are Jew haters themselves or just have been unaware of anti-Semitism and how it works project on Israel things that are inappropriate and improper, charges of colonialization, American racial categorizations that projected onto the state of Israel. There are things that that people sometimes good-naturedly advocate for without realizing that these are actually delegitimizing policies produced by anti-Semitic campaigns to undermine Israel on an international level. And so that might be beyond the scope of this lecture, but when you hear when you hear charges relating Israel to a colonistic entity, those are categories that are not really done in good faith. And it's important to remember that anti-Zionism works by and anti-Semitism works by identifying the vogue and the zeitgeist terms and inverting them so that Jews are outside of what would be normative religious or nationalistic behavior to alienate them. And we see that, all over with how public demonstrations against Israel are when there are equal, if not greater, humanitarian issues across the world that are virtually ignored by intellectuals or higher level institutions.
Thank you, Rabbi. We're going to get into some of the statistics. I know everyone was coming off of a campaign where everyone was peppered with polling every day. So here's some numbers just to whet your appetite about the Jewish community. So roughly speaking, there's about 15.7 million Jews worldwide. would represent about 0.2% of the worldwide population. Little over 7%, 7.2 million Jews live in Israel, of a population just under 10 million, and which is significant that about 20% of the Israeli population is Arab and not Jewish, and have a presence within the government, the Knesset, since the first elections in 1949, after the War of Independence. Just another thought about top 10 countries with biggest Jewish communities. A couple of these are not necessarily surprising. A couple of them were to me, but Israel, then the United States, France, Canada, United Kingdom, Argentina, Russia, Germany, Australia, and Brazil. And these communities have had long relationships with many of those communities. And in fact, a very small community that I'll be traveling to in March with Jewish Federation is Azerbaijan. And a very interesting thing about the Azerbaijani Jewish community, or Azerbaijani community in general, it's a secular country, about 90% Muslim, zero anti-Semitism, zero Jew hatred. The Islamic, Jewish, and Christian communities all get along. And so I'm very excited to learn about the community, really what's in the water in Azerbaijan, settled right between Iran and Russia, where everyone seems to get along. In fact, there's a Jewish community, the Mountain Jews of Kuba, Azerbaijan, that have been in existence for hundreds of years and have always lived peacefully and supported by the Azerbaijani community. As we talked about, Jew hatred is one of the oldest forms of religious-based hatred. As Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, anti-Semitism is often the canary in the coal mine. It's when you see increases of Jew hatred, the other forms of hate are not far behind. In fact, because since October 7th, even before that, in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years of the increased number of Jewish hatred and physical attacks against the Jewish community, the most significant line item in any budget, in any Jewish community's budget, is security. Whether it's synagogues, old age homes, Jewish community centers, and other communities or other community organizations that have a 2 to 5 times increase in their budget simply because of security. And so we've seen examples of that in Pittsburgh and Poway at some of the synagogues, and it's just a continuation of Jew hatred and attacks against the Jewish community that have been that all these communities have taken to increase their security. You can move to the next slide, Beth. Some data. The FBI data from September of last year. Again, as I said, the Jewish community is about 2% of the U.S. population, but 15% of all hate crimes has been against the Jewish community, and 68% of all religious-based hate crimes reported have been against the Jewish community, which is a roughly 140% increase in Jew hatred incidents from 2022 to 2023. And this is well before, if everyone said, well, this only happened because of October 7th, this was happening well before October 7th in the increase in hate crimes and attacks against the Jewish community as a whole for some time. Next slide, I think, is back to the rabbi.
All right. I want to, I'm glad that I got this slide, because oftentimes when we hear these statistics, we don't factor in what the reality on the ground might look like. But it looks like parents scared of sending their kids to Jewish school. It looks like parents concerned about hanging a mezuzah on their door. It looks like fear of coordinating a religious life that here in America predates the founding of our country. The first Jews came here in the 16th century, way, way before America had been founded. And it was founded with the promise of freedom of religion. George Washington wrote letters to communities in Georgia and Newport, Rhode Island, intimating just how this land would be different than where Jews had come from previous. So I I lived in Lebanon, which is close to Harrisburg. That was where the Jewish Federation was there. We were all part of the Jewish Secure Community Network. If there were individuals in the parking lot loitering or saying things or spray painting things, we would all share with each other those cases. And we were even encouraged when we went to secure training at the Capitol to have a robust, secure line item in our budget to make sure that we were meeting the rise in anti-Semitism, especially in South Central PA, as that had grown during the time that I was there. So here are more threats. Every one of these had to be somewhat investigated. If we got an email that was just tagged to my email address, we'd have to call the police. We became close with the different personnel who would tour our synagogue and check our synagogue out anytime we had a threat. It was it's not a thriving or sustainable long-term minority relationship to a larger country when life is exterminated because of the rising cost of security through populist hate, which is what this slide is showing. So we can go to the next slide now. All right, this comes for us too. This is more of a local incident of a swastika. And honestly, I'm less concerned about a swastika drawn on a sign in the middle of a night. And I'm more concerned of the reports I get from families who send their kids to public school who say, my son was bullied on the bus. Or we had one recently where there was a teacher who put together slides on the Middle East, which were softly indoctrinating 6th and 7th graders into viewing the state of Israel as delegitimate and as violence in the Middle East as particularly a Jewish problem. So even though swastikas are a visible, tangible sign of of domestic hate, we all know what a swastika stands for. The reality is the normalization of the hate is, to me, what is more concerning, and that's what I'm hearing more reports of. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, October 7th and Israel-Palestine conflict. It's hard to talk about anti-Semitism today without talking about October 7th. I almost don't necessarily agree with this. I think it's hard for certain liberal communities to talk about anti-Semitism today without referencing October 7th, because in some progressive liberal communities, there is what's known as victim blaming, where the violence that was enacted against Jews in Israel was almost given a pass. And we've seen this through LGBTQ groups that have excluded Jewish participants. We've seen this in coalition of other racial minority groups that seem to superimpose American racialization categories onto the state of Israel. And so there were a number of, to say it bluntly, really well-intentioned, kind-hearted, humanistic, universalistic Jews who felt almost betrayed by their social community because they wanted a place to grieve what was a heinous, horrible attack. And instead, they were essentially told that their emotions and their fears and their concerns were not welcome in the spaces that they had and values that they had in a lot of ways championed. So,
Rabbi, if I could, I wanted to just share a quick,
please, yeah,
and a personal experience. Last November 23, there was in the Wilmington City Council, there was a resolution calling for a unilateral ceasefire by Israel. And I, as the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council, I spoke out against it. And I mentioned in my remarks that that the Jewish community has stood with the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, the women's movement, and they've always, wherever there's been a marginalized community, the Jewish community is always there to stand with them. And one of the statements that I made was that we're just looking to be supported by the communities that we've always been supported. And I was met with that. The response that I was met with was that their relationships are not transactional like ours are. And it's just a harsh reality of hearing that when you've had relationships with friends. Look, I think we all know we have friends who have unfriended us on Facebook, who
Yeah.
forget talking American politics at the Thanksgiving table, where conversations have or don't exist anymore, with our friends, our family, work colleagues, and so on. So sorry, I just wanted to drop that sort of a personal experience in there.
No, I appreciate your personal experience. I think any Jewish person today has lost friends, and it's been a uniquely sensitive issue. And I want to just talk about maybe why that is. Um, and I want to specifically say that when we talk about history, there's no like one universal history that we all subscribe to. There's like multiple histories. And part of being Jewish is to understand Jewish history. And that history is a microcosm of diaspora history, depending on where our Jewish ancestry comes from, and also Israeli history or Israelite history, if we go back far enough to the time of the Bible. Now, a common misconception amongst, and I mentioned early on about Islamist radicalism, but a common misconception about Islamist history is that the area of the Middle East known as Israel, Palestine, should always be Arab. And this was an issue for the Middle Ages during the Crusades. There were many wars, Christian, Arab wars, about who owns Jerusalem at that time. And this has been a pan-Arab nationalistic cause to portray Israel as specifically as it should be a solidly Arab country exclusively. And so in a lot of ways, the lack of empathy given to Jews about post-October 7th is related to historical norms in different communities and how the overall American promise reaches out to those specific demographic blocks. And I think when we look at things in binaries, we undermine the individual story of empathy and of identity and of ethnicity. And so often, because Jews are the minority, that's the story that gets lost. For instance, Hen Mazig, who is quoted on one of the first slides here, his whole ancestry comes from Arab lands. His whole family was kicked out of Arab lands, in the run up to the 1940s because nationalism excluded Jews from Arab communities because they were other and different and minorities. His family had nowhere to go but Israel. So to project on someone who had been never really in the Western world a lack of empathy because of his current habitation is like the definition of delegitimizing someone and removing empathy as a weaponization. And nations can do this. Groups of people can do this. College universities, by teaching ideologies, can do this. And it veers solidly into anti-Semitism when it's only unilaterally done to Jewish people. So I make all those points to say, if someone shared with you that, they're from a Uyghur Muslim background and their family had been interned 2 million in China, I think the natural response would be empathy. However, for Jews, they've found that empathy severely lacking, non-existent, or even most insensitively, rationalized away because of a misappropriation of, again, themes and ideologies that don't fit the Middle Eastern area. I think, again, it's not hard to talk about anti-Semitism today without talking about October 7th, but it is hard to talk to people who have grown up with humanistic, universalistic promises of what religion is or should or could be, and then to explain the reality on the ground of being the sole Jewish state surrounded by Arab countries that are veering farther towards fundamentalism in their approach of Islam. So that is and American Jews have to be translators of that, sadly, and most are not prepared because it takes at least a doctorate in order to talk competently about some of these things. Okay, so we can go to the next slide now. All right, example about anti-Semitism, right? Jewish writers getting blacklisted and worrying about their publishing futures. Jewish students anxious on campus, hiding their religion. They're being barred from attending classes. Everyone is afraid. Israeli Jewish restaurants facing boycotts. Home of Jewish museum leaders in U.S. vandalized. this is so normalized. It is crazy. In it was a relief when you asked me if we could record this session today, because as I have said, and as Josh has said, we view ourselves as public speakers. We want our stuff on the record. We don't hide behind the populist throng of of force. We very much believe in the promise of liberal society, which is that if things make good argumentation, they should be listened to. However, saying that, Westchester University had a brainwashing teach-in last year that was full of speakers that refused to be videoed, refused to be recorded, and portrayed Israel as a terrorist entity. Not only was that part of the teach-in that was done by some adjunct faculty on campus and others that had Zoomed in, but it was also an opportunity for teachers in the history department or social studies department to give class credit to students who had gone to this teach-in. So you're looking at the institutionalized endorsement of like bogus ideologies that directly threaten and harm Jews. And this is the harvest of the seeds of madness, to borrow language from an Elie Wiesel story. It's sad. It is dangerous. It is something that no Jewish family is unaware of, and it forces Jews to either entirely hide their identity or only find safety in Jewish spaces that can provide for the complexity and nuance of their individual identity.
Thank you.
So, Rabbi, what was done about Westchester University's? Is it a freedom of speech kind of thing, or
Yes. So we met with the president of the university at the time. He had Fiorello. He has since moved on. And he basically said this was put on by professors that know the rule of law here, and they know what they can get away with, and they're pushing the limits. And they were very crafty as how they build and put this together. And if they step over the line, I will, have a case against them. But they are so close to the line that sadly, there's nothing I can do. And these campus style classes and protests are, to borrow the words of Rabbi Maury Hoberman, who is one of the esteemed elder rabbis and statesmen of this congregation.
Yes.
He said Jews have been very good at paying universities in order that they build buildings so that they can educate the masses. And sadly, fundamentalist Arab states have been very good at paying universities to hire certain professors for redactive history purposes. So you have on these college protests and campuses, unlike the 60s or the 70s, where you had protests on college campuses where anyone would talk to you about free love, about pacifism, about, anti-war. On today's college campuses, when there are anti-Zionist protests, everyone points you to the one spokesperson who oftentimes is a plant there. I think Columbia University had people in their 30s and 40s who were planted on campus. You have Harvard University have the same redactive history individuals. These are coordinated efforts, oftentimes by foreign entities, to diminish progressive education through endorsing really bad ideological nationalism at the expense of Jewish minority students. And this is what we're seeing. Sorry to go on to a little bit of a rant there.
No, it's information that we need to understand.
Right. And I think it's important to bring it home. You can talk about this sort of in a, when you talk about what's going on at Westchester University, it's much different than kind of seeing what happens on the news nationwide. So is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? I think there's a wonderful organization called the Monk Debates where this was debated a few months ago. If you have a chance, it's about an hour and a half debate. You can find it on YouTube. But just people I agree with, people I completely disagree with. But what I really liked about that was everyone was coming and having that conversation together, which sadly sometimes is a rarity today, where you can get people from both sides of an issue and have a fruitful and complete conversation. So is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? No. As most Israelis criticize the Israeli government on a daily basis, I would say that whether a Sabra born in Israel or someone who becomes Israeli, they're issued a passport and their ability to criticize the Israeli government. And they're certainly not anti-Semitic and not Jew haters. But being able to criticize the policies of a government are completely different than denying Israel's place as the state of the Jewish people, which is Jew hatred. Just a story before October 7th, as you many were following the judicial reform protests that were going on in Israel, hundreds of thousands of people were gathering, protesting the Israeli government's push to change the rules regarding the courts. And after October, there was a discussion within Israel. It's been divided so much that God forbid something happens from a security standpoint, will Israelis come together? And we saw what happened after October 7th, as far as 350,000 reservists who came together to support Israel's safety and security. And in just one note, there was the leader of the judicial reform protests is in an infantry unit. He's a reservist in an infantry unit. One of the leaders of the prime minister's push to change the judicial reform they are both in the same reserve infantry unit. And on October 8th, I think they were both called up in the reserve units. And I want to say it was within a couple of days, there was a picture of the two of them on getting ready to be deployed, but showing that Israelis come together. They may criticize each other on a daily basis, but they certainly come together for the time of need for Israel's security. One thing that I would say about those who call them we talked about this a little bit before, being pro-Israel does not mean you're anti-Palestinian. I would say the vast majority of those that would consider themselves pro-Israel would also consider themselves pro-Palestinian, as we talked about. Many believe in a two-state solution, safe and secure Israel, again, next to a Palestinian state. So many would say that they are those who call themselves pro-Israel would also say they're pro-Palestinian. But sadly, I don't think the reverse is true. And that you can be both a Zionist and support Palestinian rights, and they are not mutually exclusive. And again, we talked about what Zionism, the historical definition of what Zionism is and what many people consider it to be today. Back in the Rabbi helped me with my history, I want to say back in the 70s, the Zionism, or early 80s, Zionism is racism, was passed in the General Assembly.
Yeah.
In the UN General Assembly, and then overturned, I want to say 94.
Yeah.
My history is sort of right.
Right. So, and one
Yep.
of the things, sadly, that, and it's kind of like above the parameters of this lecture, is that institutions don't always remain the same, and participations in institutions change, and it changes the culture of the institutions. And so, whereas the UN could have been in its incipient form in the 1920s, when it was begun to be woven together, a really good-natured attempt to pull different communities, different geographic communities together in humanistic hopes for peace. Sadly, today it is kind of like a bully pulpit of radical demagogues and dictatorships. And so oftentimes, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? The answer is clearly a yes, when the only people who are talking anti-Zionistically are talking specifically about Israel and not about any other states that have worse or more egregious human rights violations. And that's something that is related to different communities' affinity for certain philosophical concepts. I'll just say that, like, there are people who view Israel as the unfulfilled promise of Christianity. And so if Israel is not the fulfilled promise of Christianity, Israel deserves, to be destroyed, perchance. So that might be a reason why someone is anti-Zionist. Another reason could be, as I mentioned before, maybe pan-Arab nationalism and the belief that Israel should only be Arab. That could be a specific hyper-focus on Israel rather than any other nations in the area. Another one could be, a sensitivity to a rejection of a Jewish faith. There are what's known as self-hating Jews. There are Jews that have really horrible baggage from the Jewish religion, and they project that on the state of Israel, and often they're tokenized by larger movements. So this question of anti-Zionism, is it anti-Semitism? If it comports to regular criticisms of regular countries, then no, it's not. It's not anti-Semitism. It's actually edifying and allowing a state to engage in statecraft and dialogue with other neighbors and on an equal playing field. However, if you started a debate with someone from Mexico or China or Australia with your country shouldn't exist, there's no real compromise with a position that views your existence as as unequivocally not real. That's not a good faith negotiation, and that's oftentimes why people who are rampantly anti-Zionist either refuse to be recorded or videoed, or they slide into baseless hatred and canards because they don't have an ideological, rational, philosophical belief to stand on outside of hate.
Thank you, Rabbi. Something that Rabbi mentioned about where there's this increased criticism of Israel was on the UN General Assembly, UN Security Council. I forget the numbers, but the violations purported against Israel far exceed any other country when it comes to human rights violations. I use the example of the Wilmington, Delaware City Council had a resolution last year calling for unilateral ceasefire by Israel. This was in November of 23. It was focused on Israel, certainly not Hamas's stopping to doing what they're doing. And when I spoke out against it at the conclusion of my remarks, someone stood up who I know in the audience and called me a Zionist pig. And I've, many have said, I can't believe that's, and I said, I've been called worse by better. So that's okay. But when I've said that to people, if you think about it, if I replace Zionist pig with any other epithet, I doubt that it would be accepted in any polite society, including city council chambers. These city councils and local governments have been passing these resolutions throughout the country. There's been a lot of work within the different Jewish communities and I'm going to say pro-Israel communities, not just the Jewish community, because I think the pro-Israel community, the pro-Israel community and the Jewish community are certainly not the same. Again, there's been a lot of support outside the Jewish community for Israel, and there's been a lot of work to knock down these resolutions, and so there's been a lot of that. But again, those resolutions that are only focusing on what Israel's doing, not whether or not about returning hostages, not regarding of what Hamas or Hezbollah is engaged in, certainly those anti-Zionist activities are still being accepted around the country. Next slide, please. Okay, Title VI in the First Amendment. This is something we talked about at Westchester University, and we saw a lot in the spring with a lot of the activities on college campuses around the country. But you need, I think, when you had these sit-ins and these encampments, is that one being able to, especially being in college, separating protesting against Israel, again, against the Israeli government, against the Israeli policies is certainly legitimate, versus prohibiting the free movement of Jewish students around campus, threatening physical harm against Jewish students and those supporting Israel, and removing Jewish students from college organizations, whether they're, again, involved with the LGBTQ community and other marginalized communities. These are all examples of where there's the difference between supporting or protesting Israel versus protesting the Jewish community and causing harm to the Jewish community. And there's the dichotomy between Title VI, where there's been, certainly you've seen it obviously at Penn. We saw it on the national level with Penn and Harvard and MIT, as well as some other countries, and including the physical altercations at a number of universities around the country. And these are being worked through with the U.S. Department of Justice, as well as local departments of justice and states' attorneys' offices.
And I want to jump in here and say that this is a uniquely dangerous phenomenon that has really only grown in the last decade, in the sense of, like, one of the ways that anti-Semitism is justified by higher intellectuals is by viewing this as like punching up. So we have the concept of, like, whereas a normal racism is this group of people is worse than I am, and so my hatred of them is to be different than them, and that we find ugly and abhorrent, and we can just feel how that just that goes against God's creation of everyone being sacred and B'Tselem Elohim in God's image. But with Jewish hatred and how it's taught on college campuses, it's that Jews are all powerful. Jews are this conspiracy, the globalists, the nationalists, the rootless cosmopolitans, to use the words of Karl Marx. And so because of that, this anti-Semitism is almost justified. And this is what your patriotic duty should be, is to hate Jews. So the way it's actually being taught on college campuses is almost more dangerous than in the gutters of places like the KKK or very right-wing nationalistic groups, because we can see that as obvious hatred and obvious danger. But on college campuses, it's a lot more seductive, and that's why these types of cases are really important for preserving the dignity of a religious minority that has historic roots in America.
Rabbi, sorry, I'm gonna jump for 1 second. I apologize. I have to do something really quick. I'll be back in like 2 minutes. Sorry.
Okay. The bottom here, accusing Zionists or anyone who supports the existence of Israel of behavior associated with age-old tropes, promoting the notion Zionists or Jews are disloyal to the United States, Zionist litmus tests, or excluding Jewish students from campus life. Not only is that something that I've heard testimony of college students going through themselves, but that was the exact litmus test of Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union before Lenin formed the Yevetsky, which was a group of Jewish intellectuals which were known to associate with the party in order to purge the party of non-loyal Jews. And then when those Jews filled their purpose, they were all murdered because Lenin had no more purpose for them. So we've seen now the cannibalization of Jews that have tokenized themselves in order to get farther in these groups of college, higher educational communities. And it's quite sad. In our book club book, we just studied a book written by a very left-wing Jew who, despite his insistent and incredible support for the Palestinian cause and everything else, was prevented from speaking at a Brooklyn bookstore because he was not anti-Zionist enough. So this is a phenomena that is only growing, and a silver lining of it is that it's forcing Jews who might have been less particular about their identity to reform their identity so that they can have a Jewish community that they feel comfortable with. So what I mean to say is that Kesher Israel, among other places, has become a reception hub for Jews who have been confronted with this type of anti-Semitism, who need a place to process it. And that's what we do for them.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Trying to manage work and Zooms in the same during the day. Next, can we move over to DEI? Thank you. So anti-Semitism with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. I just want to say, I think again, this is all my personal opinion. In theory, DEI is great, but we've seen in practice that we have not had good results, whether it's been the undiversification, if that's even a word, of businesses and corporations, college campuses, college organizations, the non-inclusion of certain groups, whether it's a Jewish community or others, and we're focused on the Jewish community regarding Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. But in regards to the Jewish community, that in many circles regarding DEI, that the Jewish community is not considered a marginalized community, so DEI shall not apply. And these are just part of the bigger issues dealing with the Jewish community that, again, going to the bigger issue of Jew hatred. We've talked about, again, a lot here to read. I don't want to go through it, but I think it's just been an opportunity to kind of really talk about these different specific scenarios that we've all discussed. Again, I'm just going to read the one. DE programs divide people into oppressors and oppressed. This leaves little room to address the Jewish people's history of oppression and challenges them face today as a religious minority. Some will say, well, we have, the 6 Jewish governors and 5 of them first name starts with a J and one of them starts with an M. You know, how can they be how can they be the oppressed? We have you know, members of the federal government and top business leaders and so on and so forth. They can't be oppressed, but the breaking it all down on what the Jewish community has faced over the years and today, again, with harm, both our Jewish organizations and institutions, and what children or college students are facing on college campuses, that they're not considered a religious minority or marginalized community, all goes to the problems with what DEI. And then you've seen a pushback regarding DEI. Again, I think in theory, the idea of a diverse community, equitable ideas, and an inclusive community are wonderful, but that's not how it's been in practice. See if there's any other thoughts on that, Rabbi?
No, I mean, sadly, one of the there are sometimes really good cultural habits, and sometimes there are cultural habits that aren't so productive in integration in American society. You know, and sometimes DEI, in the name of inclusion, incorporates things that can be destructive to Jews. I had mentioned before, there is a reality of anti-Semitism in you know, historically in Arab lands, and by including Arab history in DEI initiatives, Jewish identity, as we've seen in the educational curriculum of California, has been very much marginalized. So sometimes there are blind spots because to get to the nuance of individual diversity, equity, and inclusion, we remove the uncomfortable Jewish sense of history or identity that sometimes stands in stark contrast to the larger American history, because we are a minority.
Thank you. Next, I think we're moving on to the video. Yep.
You know, I think on the just in the interest of time, we might skip the video and certainly include it in our follow-up, and just kind of open this up for discussions, observations. I see some faces. I want to invite you guys to turn on your cameras for this part. I also see someone I want to invite to join our discussion, Maury Hoberman. Thank you for joining us. So yeah, just we have some discussion questions, or you can kind of just chime in with your own observations.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for providing the forum to address so many in this Chester County community discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Something that I very much try to do is engage in conversation, whether it's with groups that I agree with or groups that I don't agree with. Something that I've certainly taken as chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council is meeting with organizations and leaders who I completely disagree with. We don't have a we will talk for an hour. We may not agree on anything, but we've kept it civil and continuing to have that conversation. So I'm, you know, with any group, there's always, as I say, Rabbi, I say those all love. When you have 10 rabbis, there's 15 opinions. So I'm sure with any group, there's always difference of opinions. So, you know, I encourage the free flowing questions and ideas, whether they're good, bad, or ugly. And that's
Yeah.
And you don't even have to raise your hand if you just want to kind of turn your camera on, turn your microphone on. You can share your thoughts.
I do want to make another point, which is that there was one I might have been able to peripherally mention it earlier, but it's kind of a side point, which is that democracy is a fairly new invention, and Jews have lived in communities as a minority for a very long time, predating democracy. In fact, when democracy started to roll around with the House of the Commons and stuff in England, in Britain, in Europe, Jews sometimes felt that this populistic trend of letting people decide through democracy would threaten them. And so Jews went further east into Poland and at that point in time, you know, Russia, you know, the outskirts of Russia, in order that they could have the explicit promise of a ruler to be protected. So the Jewish, at least traditionally, historically, the Jewish expectation of democracy in America has been a promise of a golden land, provided religious expression is supported and diligently watered so that the fruits of the religious diversity can become real. But the reality is we might be moving into an era that has less democracy, in which case the even older principle of, what do we do, rears its head. And there's Jews who ardently, support Republican Party and Trump as president, and there are Jews that ardently support the Democratic Party and the candidate on that side on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and this has been a very divisive time for the Jewish people as well. And to expect political solutions to the question of anti-Semitism is in fact a misunderstanding of history, because anti-Semitism exists and it will exist no matter what. And the question for society, especially for American society, is can we face unfavorable political situations and geopolitical, expectations while still not giving ourselves to the baser instinct that vilifies the minority, which has always been identified as Jew? That is really the question. And so, whereas it would be great if democratically we could find solutions to the problems our society finds itself in, there is another reality that there will be a strong hand government that maybe from the top down tries to work new situations. We pray for success, but we also prepare for maybe not so much. And we also hope and pray that Jews are not uniquely alienated, although history proves something else.
That's why he's the rabbi, everybody. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
This is Brad Rappaport. I do have a question regarding commentary around an independent state for the Palestinians. If the Palestinians won't agree to recognize Israel's right to exist, how do you ever get to an independent state? And secondly, from the dialogue that you see across the world, basically, at least in my travels, there just seems to be overwhelming, I don't know, a slant to inaccuracy in support of the Palestinian cause, and a lot of false dialogue and false history being directed to many people who don't research what is being read or said. And I wonder how do you combat that when most of the youth is looking at TikTok, and when you look at TikTok, there's not a whole lot of pro-Israel dialogue or balanced Israel dialogue when it comes to the Palestinian issue.
At least from my perspective, I just try. Again, I try to sit down. All we can do is try. It may sound, it may be an impossible task. I try to do it. Maybe it's one person at a time, 10 people at a time. I reach out to a lot of people, again, as I disagree with. Some people are willing to sit down with me. Some people aren't. And I just got to keep trying. And I think for the community, for the pro-Israel community, Jewish community, whatever marginalized community, just trying to engage with those you may disagree with. And it's okay to have those hard questions. The geopolitical question of, those who support a Palestinian state, but if those who are going to be leading that Palestinian state don't recognize Israel as the Jewish state, how do you get there to an independent Palestinian state? I hate to be repetitive, just you keep trying. I think it was Bill Clinton was interviewed last week. He's been saying this for 25 years. In 2000, Yasser Arafat was offered, I want to say, roughly 98% of the West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem as the independent capital of the Palestinian state, and turned it down. And you just got to keep trying. And it's not easy. Even with, I would say this, I don't know how many ceasefire resolutions there's been since October 7th of 2023. The question is, let's say a ceasefire resolution's on the table and Israel agrees. Some say they have and they haven't, and Bibi's gone back and forth. Again, you can find every Israeli who will agree and disagree with Bibi, but who's on the other side to agree to the ceasefire on the Hamas side? There are representatives from Hezbollah who've agreed, and so there's their ceasefire. It's tentative, it's tenuous, but it's still holding in the north. But there's a question of who represents Hamas or the Palestinian people who can achieve that peace. So I think that you can try and have one, but trying to find those leaders who will, and everyone will agree to is certainly not a very difficult question.
I think, Brad, in your question, there's multiple realities of why this crisis has gone on for so long. I think if we had peace partners who were reliable and in good faith, I think that there could be a negotiation that would have been at least, the beginnings of a peace process. But Israel has always been on the Silk Road between Africa and China, the Far East. And it's always been in this contentious zone between giant nations that use it as a tug of war. Philosophically, we see this with how the Jewish faith is used as a crucible in politics. And then like physically, because of the way that the Middle East is just geographically set. Whereas other nations might be able to isolate similarities and come to geopolitical agreements in a small microcosm, Israel is perpetually negotiating between all of the big Arab countries who have ideas about what it should be, and the larger Western world, which has maybe guilt over the last couple wars and a past of colonialism that is projected. So these questions of the peace process, in as much as they depend on the personalities on the ground, primarily, they also depend on these larger structures saying, as the Iranian Ayatollah, I'm not going to assassinate the moderate pro-peace groups in the area. And similarly, as Western corporate interests, I'm going to, have some parameters and boundaries on the peace negotiation itself that are sacrosanct.
But Brad, if you figure out a way for two-state solution to work and all parties come to the table, I'm sure there's some people in Washington who'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, happy to participate as long as somebody is willing to compromise.
Right. Any other questions?
An observation, something that you said, Rabbi, kind of hit me where in this post-October 7th world, your Jewish identity matters more and your Jewish community matters more. So I just want to say that definitely rang true for me as like an individual. Also like a newer parent where like it wasn't as important before, and now I'm raising my daughter in this world. So this is the world we live in and this is my responsibility. And I didn't take it as seriously before, so certainly not something I would have wished for, but something I have come to terms with in this, new world.
Thank you, Beth. And one of the things I want to say too, I look out, I see a lot of congregants, I see a lot of people whom I assume are, Jewish. For those who are not Jewish, when these trends really accelerate as they are, you would expect in another 10 years, in another 15 years, in another 20 years, that the Jews who live surrounded by non-Jews, who go to public school, who go to these more secular institutions, will feel less and less comfortable and will disappear. And this is a phenomenon across history. And it's like simple economics. If it's too expensive to afford security, to exist in the way with the friends that you've had, you find a place of lower pressure where you can exist. This is what happens in France in the last 30 years. This is what's been happening in England. And society loses a huge deal. Society loses because Jewish history is an alternative way to look at the history of the mother country. Anyone in Germany needs to know Yiddish because the records of medieval Germany was kept in Yiddish by the Jews who lived there. So you lose how the country operates, and you also you lose the unique perspective that a minority that's been geographically across the world as a diaspora has adapted to relate to its parent country. And I fear for America, because as America gets more intolerant, it's not just Jews who are going to have to find places of lower pressure to exist and to celebrate Jewish religious life, but it's the parent country that's going to find themselves without a minority upon which to test their tolerability and the higher ethics that they ostensibly subscribe to.
Well,
I can say as an African American, certainly I'm used to the pressures of being in the minority class, but there's so much to unpack here. And I'm wondering, where do you see it with the new administration coming? There's a lot that it's been on the radar about the direction of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and initiatives such as those. Where do you see us headed, say, in the short term?
Okay, so there's a couple. Thank you for your question. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here, part of this group, and the invitation I've received to be here, as well as Josh. I think that there are some windows of history where bureaucracy and democracy are just temporarily suspended because there are real policy ends that need to be met. And when that happens, things get pretty dictatorial. We saw this during World War II. We saw this during the Civil War. We saw this during the Revolutionary War. I think with the way things are geopolitically setting up, we're getting there, which means that whether it's the incoming administration or the subsequent administration, or who knows, because we're in a very fragile world, we're going to get some pretty heavy-handed policies that require collective sacrifice, of which we haven't seen for quite some time. And that means that it's up to the moral fiber and the relationships we've currently built, including this organization, to maintain a level of humanism, collegiality, fraternity, and cooperation amongst different faith-based and ethnic backgrounds. It means that we need to be the ones to invest in the stories to prevent the dehumanization of the other. And during World War II, I mention this sometimes quite often, Japanese Americans were interned because of the war effort. And ultimately, America won the war, but at the cost of the humanity of citizens that were, just the wrong ethnic background. So what does it take to preserve our humanity in a time period that requires a great sacrifice, where doubt and fear sometimes override the larger, more empathetic qualities that I believe religion's mission is to instill upon us?
And the question is, does it? That's the...
Yeah. And I, at least just from this conversation, I know you have a friend in Josh and me. If you ever need a rabbi, I'm here for you.
Thank you.
So let me, can I just jump in here and let me say, when I was young, I used to think I could have discussions on how to solve the problems of the world. And I know that anti-Semitism has been around more than 2,000 years. I think that the value of this kind of discussion is to look at our own community. I appreciate everybody that's on this call, and I know it's being recorded, that we in our own community can work together to increase the level of understanding of the Jewish people with their compatriots in the community, and to work together in areas. And I see people here from Active Faith and people from all various organizations to work together. I know that, and Ms. Hammond is here, who was the president of the NAACP, and I know that the NAACP is very sensitive to these issues. We've had that discussion. I think that's where it starts. We can't always solve the problems of the world, but we can solve the problems in our local community. And for each one of us to speak up against anti-Semitism or any other kind of divide that creates a problem for each one of us in each one of our individual communities. Whereas, as Rabbi Yolen said, we are all created in the image of God, and we have to recognize that.
Amen.
Well, I just want to say sorry, Beth. I was just going to say thank you again for the invitation to join you all today and to be with the Rabbi and all of you.
Well, we're really grateful for all of your time, and we're gonna meet again monthly, in the new year. We might revisit our topics, so we'll certainly invite you all to join us to continue this conversation on all the issues affecting our community, anti-Semitism, amongst many other, groups who are facing unique issues that are, worthy of our time and discussion. And also, like, hopefully we can all kind of work together, because we're all in this together, as we've discussed.
Can I
So-
just say this was really enlightening? My pastor preached not long ago about reaching out to other people outside of our individual circle. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own silo and our own issues and that we don't consider the plight and the concerns of other groups sometimes. You understand what I'm saying? So it was, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. That was rich for me. Thank you.
And thank you for saying that, Joyce. You speak for us. Please be well, stay healthy. We have much, much to do.
Thanks very much.
Thank
you
you.
all.